So what a great discussion so far. And we still have 2 more pieces to go, which are going to be equally exciting. And I'm really thrilled to listen to this next panel, which is going to focus on the intersectionality of leadership commitment, employee retention, and success. And leading this discussion is Elizabeth Williams-Riley. Elizabeth is the president and CEO of DASH Consulting. She's an esteemed figure in the realm of DEI, and since 1995 has been at the forefront of promoting diversity and fostering inclusion environments. She leads her organization, helping others develop assets for successful habits, cultivating empowerment and ownership to embrace diversity and practice inclusion. With that, I'd like to invite Elizabeth and our panelists, Mona, Michele, and Gerri, up to the stage. All yours.
All right, buckle up, hold on tight, here we go. So thank you so much for having me here as a moderator today. You notice she mentioned I have been doing this work since 1995. I started when I was 2, that's my story, I'm sticking to it. This idea of diversity, I started doing this work, I call it BD, before diversity, because we weren't talking about it with the same language. When I started and entered this work, we were talking about human relations, how we relate to each other. So if you keep that in mind as you hear the panel and you hear their stories and they talk about their journeys from the roles that they play and the lives that they live, I want you to keep that in mind. When we talk about this work, we're talking about human relations. And we're talking about this idea of intersectionality, and I just wanted to be clear, and I met with the panel and we talked about this because that term is a very important term in the space of DEI. Because intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used this phrase to help us understand how our multiple identities, when they are presented and when we are living through those multiple identities, how we can have very different experiences. So when our multiple identities intersect, we have different experiences. So I, as an African-American woman, can have a shared identity with a white woman, but still have very different experiences. The intersectionality of our differences cause that different experience. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor at UCLA and at Columbia University, and she also was the founder of critical race theory. So if you want to look up more about intersectionality, because it is important to our DEI space, please take a look at that. So as we talk about the intersectionality of leadership commitment, employee retention, and success, that's that trifecta, right? So the ideas that the group presented were really exciting. So I decided their stories are amazing. They are amazing, and they will drop some bombs today, which are, when I say bombs, bombs of understanding, bombs to disrupt some of those early messages that don't serve us anymore. And it's important to do that. So I'm gonna have each of them introduce themselves and tell you the one word that describes how they feel about DEI right now. So we'll start to my left with Mona.
All right, I'll kick us off. Thank you, everyone, for having us here today. My name is Mona Babury. I am the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for our medtech sector over at Johnson & Johnson. I've been there for about 7 months now. I'm coming from Pfizer, where I spent 16 years across various functions, including supply chain, technology, and the last 6 years as global diversity, equity, and inclusion leader at Pfizer. And so I'm excited to be here today and tell you a little bit more about our journeys and hopefully drop some good bombs on different tactics that you can take back and leverage in your workplaces. And so one word I will leave you with as I think about DEI and where we're moving into this new phase is hopeful.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Michele Brown. I'm a certified executive coach and consultant with Crothers Consulting. This is my second career. I spent 25 years prior to becoming a coach in corporate, not at all in sort of the HR or talent development space, but this is my purpose and my passion. And I would say that my one word relative to DEIB is it's essential, it's an imperative. I cheated 2 words.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gerri Budd. I'm the co-founder of Peace in Action. It's also my second career. My co-founder and I do corporate training, municipal equity audits, all kinds of workshops and programs to further professional development. My previous career, which is also current, is I'm a university professor. I teach at Montclair State and William Patterson. And when I think about DEI, the word I think of is intentional.
So when we had our conversations earlier, we talked about a number of things that resonated with all of our experiences. One of the things that came up in our conversation was this notion of looking at how we really define safe space. And there's no real thing as a safe space, because people struggle every day to be in spaces that they feel are unsafe. So we talked about this notion of being more brave and courageous in our spaces. And so how do we develop the courage and that commitment to be in those spaces? So when we talk about the spaces that we have all worked to co-create in our careers, we're talking about creating those brave spaces for individuals to thrive and to succeed. So that's the lens in which we'll kind of be speaking from. There were 3 main areas that were important to each of us. The first one was around understanding contemporary and historical intersections. How does what we do now have an attachment to what we've done in the past? The other piece was, how do we move along that continuum and not just stay in the space of knowledge and knowing, but how do we transform information and knowledge into action? How do we do that? And lastly, how do we develop, and this came up earlier, the psychological safety that is necessary? And psychological safety speaks to the idea that when you are bold and courageous in your space, there are no consequences of judgment, retaliation, or judgment, right? So this notion of how do we come to the table as mutual contributors, mutual learners, mutual challengers, and we feel that it's important to do and it's welcomed and valued. So I'm going to start first with Gerri, because when she talked about this contemporary historical connection, she shared a story with us, and I'd like her to share it with you as well.
Thank you. I'm happy to. What I like to make comparisons and give examples that are accessible. And the one thing that struck me was the eclipse. We all watched the eclipse, we all stopped and watched it. And it occurred to me, because I'm a science fiction geek and the whole thing, but it occurred to me that we didn't really see the eclipse. Because the sun is so far away, the light takes 10, 20 minutes to get here. We actually saw a past event, but it affected us in the present. Also, likewise, if we think about starlight, the stars we see every night, the stars are billions of light years away. The light we're looking at every night isn't the present. It was generated in the past. It was generated billions of years ago. And I think it's the same with a lot of ideas and worldviews and framings. A lot of the ideas that shape some of the issues we contend with most today come to us from the past, even though we have them today. Ideas about, specifically, the British Empire was very into ranking, and we know we have a direct connection to the British Empire. Ranking of people by race. Of course, Britons were at the top, and then they sorted out different countries of Europe and different countries of the world in rankings in order of importance, how close they are to the animal world. And when we think about things that have happened that we're fighting with, we're talking about how are people viewed, how are people included, who belongs, who doesn't. We are, just like starlight, we are seeing things that have come to us from the past. And it's important for us to recognize that and also to grapple with that.
One of the things I believe wholeheartedly is age is mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter, right? But we know for a fact that generational diversity plays a significant role in the way that businesses are perceived. And so I wanted to ask Gerri, could you talk about some of the things that you have heard from young folks on campuses that talk about what they're looking for when they want to enter into the workforce or be a part of an organization or company?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to. We had the opportunity last year to do an attitudinal audit of a small town in Massachusetts. And they wanted to know how welcome a DEI initiative would be in the town. And we interviewed the law enforcement, firefighters, the school supervisory structure, the library, and in that audit, we had the chance to also interview students with their parents' permission from the student government of the high school in the town. It was a tiny little town. And speaking of intersectionality, race was not really at the top of their minds. Other types of identities were at issue. But what was very noteworthy was that the adults all thought, we have no problem, we're happy, we love our town, everything's fine. The kids, like, no, everything is not fine. They don't understand. We care deeply about these issues. We care about identities that we don't share. They cared about race issues. They cared about gender issues. They cared about all these things. And the college students that I teach now are very attuned to if they are going to feel welcome, if they're going to feel supported, is the corporate culture or the workplace culture that I'm entering into, will it understand me? They are very, they've gotten practice in advocating for themselves. They will come and tell you, I'm overwhelmed, I can't get this assignment done, in ways that I think are very foreign to those of us who went to school in another time. But they're going to bring that self-awareness into the job, and these are them. These are the workers of the future. If our corporations, if our employers are not sensitive to how the workers want to work, I don't know how the long-term success of that organization will look.
So that's the idea of employee retention. How do we retain those that we're recruiting into our space? One of the things that I also know, when we talk about generational experiences and lived and learned experiences, age. If you live long enough, you're going to experience all sides of that. Either being too young or too old or not old enough, whatever that looks like in terms of experiencing and having an experience around that level of diversity. So being mindful of that is very critical. Now, Mona talked about this idea of leadership commitment and what that really means. Could you share with the group how you meet people where they are?
So on the previous panel, we spoke a little bit about the executive commitment that's absolutely needed when you're implementing any kind of DEI strategy or people strategy, right, or engagement strategy. The executive committee, they kind of set the tone for the organization. And I mentioned I joined Johnson & Johnson. I'm about 7 months in, and one of the things that I observed immediately was they have their global DEI summit. Is the executive committee, the entire executive committee was on the stage, and they each sponsor an ERG, and they each spoke about how they're active within those communities, how they're constantly learning, how they're constantly engaging in their support of these DEI strategies within each ERG, but again, of the overall enterprise strategy. And so when we talk about how does that cascade within the organization, it's great to see the entire executive committee on board and engaged and excited, but how does that cascade to an organization of 150,000 or 90,000 or 50,000 employees globally? There's a few different routes and a few different strategies that you do have to approach different leaders with. And so I mentioned in our conversation, meeting leaders where they're at. And sometimes that's a one-on-one conversation. Sometimes that is a training. Sometimes that's a courageous conversation with a team. And sometimes there's different strategies. You'll approach one leader and they're like, okay, DEI is great. What can I do? How can I advance it? I want to create an inclusive culture. And you'll approach another leader who says, I have business objectives. I have outcomes I have to meet. This is something that's going to need to wait. And so you, as someone who's an ambassador, or if you're in a DEI role, you have to understand your stakeholders, understand who your audience is, and be prepared during that conversation to go one route or the other. And so for those that seem to not understand the value that DEI brings from a business imperative perspective, you have to be prepared to come in and say, hey, I notice your business strategy says you want to innovate more, you want to, exceed your financial goals, you need to produce more cash flow, you need to exceed these goals. Well, guess what? The most recent research says that if you focus on diverse and inclusive teams, you'll be 6 times more innovative. How does that sound? How does it sound if your employees are producing 2.5 times more cash flow than they are today? How does it sound to be 8 times more high performing? And they're like, okay, they're starting to see, okay, where's Mona going with this? And at the end, it's like, okay, well, in order to get your employees outperforming your goals or producing more cash flows, guess what? We have to focus on inclusion. Guess what? We have to focus on diverse perspectives and bringing in a diverse team. We have to focus on creating this sense of belonging. And yes, psychological safety is a big component of that, because if you bring this diverse team of leaders and employees together and they don't feel safe voicing their ideas, whether that's a new idea where we haven't, went that way before, or the company doesn't do it that way, they have to be able to have that safe space to voice that idea and know that it's going to be taken seriously and valued and respected. So again, understanding your stakeholders, understanding your leaders, understanding what they value as a leader, and bringing it to them as, hey, this is what's in it for you, is really important to setting up successful DEI approaches.
One of the things that you have done as a part of your career is work with affinity groups. Can you tell us a little bit about the refugee affinity group that you started?
Yeah, absolutely. So it wasn't an affinity group. It was more of an initiative. And I am married to my husband of 11 years, who is Afghan and was a former refugee. His family was a former refugee in the past. And so we all saw in the news a few years ago, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, and you saw all these people getting on planes, leaving their offices, their government offices, or humanitarian work, and fleeing, not knowing where they're going. And we know about, a little over 70,000 landed here in the United States. And so I'm watching this on the news, and I'm like, okay, I feel like I have to do something. I'm in this role. I'm global DEI lead. I see people here who there's a significant need for what they're going to do when they land in these countries. And immediately I sent a text message. I didn't know where it was going to land. The worst case is someone's going to say no to you, right? I sent a text message to our chief people officer at the time, and I said, hey, 70,000 people are landing in the U.S. Can we consider offering career opportunities for those that are qualified to work at Pfizer? And she said, go for it. And I was like, wait, what? And so I met with employment law. I had no idea what it took to employ refugees from an equity perspective, because we know that different groups of people need very different things in order to compete fairly. And I worked with NGOs, I worked with our recruiters, I worked to train managers, I worked with a fantastic organization called Tent for Refugees to understand what it's going to take. And we stood up this program and made a commitment to hire 500 refugees by 2025 from all backgrounds. And so I met refugees from Venezuela, Colombia, Syria, Palestine, and I stood up this program across the United States and across Europe, and really offering an equitable process to employment, because we know that research shows that refugees, when they apply through typical job routes, they're typically not considered, their resumes are filtered out because they don't have that one-to-one match of working in a corporate space like we are working in now. And so how do you look at their transferable skills as they enter the workforce, amongst many other considerations, including onboarding and engagement. So that was one of the programs I've been lucky enough to deliver.
Mm-hmm. And all of this speaks to the idea of having flexibility in your approach. Absolutely. So Michele, this brings you right down Front Street on this, in terms of looking at coaching and how you engage folks around diversity, equity, inclusion when it comes to building that capacity internally.
Well, it boils down to ensuring that within an organization, they have a strategy. You know, DEIB is a nice to have, but until it becomes a essential strategic initiative and objective, it may not necessarily be sustainable. So from a coaching or even a consulting perspective, what we do is want to sort of sensitize, especially at the leadership level, how important it is that the business objectives incorporate how DEIB is going to be implemented and integrated throughout the organization, and anchoring it to performance objectives, what leaders are going to be evaluated on. Because if they don't necessarily have skin in the game and how they're going to be evaluated, again, it's a nice to have. So ensuring that from a strategic planning perspective, they are looking at what are the objectives, what's the goal that we're ultimately going for. And then through data collection and perhaps even employee engagement surveys, look to see where the gaps are, where the challenges are. And then the strategy can be developed and authored in the sense that what do we need to do to get from where we are to where we ultimately need to be. So it has to start with a strategic plan that, again, is adapted by every and any function and department within an organization, and it's got to sort of connect to that overarching business objective, and it can be year to year or, you know, on a 3-year basis, whatever the length of time. But again, the balance is making sure that it is an imperative and it's a strategic objective of the organization.
One of the things that everyone kind of landed on our common ground was this idea of, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that it's only as good as those who enforce it, right? Just like laws, policies, and practices, they're only as good as those who enforce them. And oftentimes, those who are most vulnerable rely on policy, rely on law, rely on practice to thrive and succeed within an organization. So, Gerri, can you talk a little bit more about how you are seeing some of the conversations and dialogue shifting based on what we know about the redefinition of DEI and also the attempt to ban it?
Yes, it was very surprising to me that it quickly turned into such a contentious issue. After the events of 2020, a lot of organizations, a lot of municipalities, a lot of corporations discovered DEI. They tried to sort of superimpose it on their organizations, and it wasn't an intentional effort. And the backlash was quite surprising, but when we zoom out and look at people who have been included, people who have been excluded, people who are not encouraged to think about these issues, we see that some of the resistance to it came from not ever having to engage in it. There are a lot of people who never had to think about it, who were under the impression that it's solved, it's over. We had civil rights, we had women's rights, we have marriage equality, we had Obama. What do we need now? So it's a question of making sure that those people are seen also, that the need for inclusion, the need for diversity, the need to address the demographics of the generation coming is no attack on what exists now. It's not an attempt to silence or marginalize people who are at the center now. That was something that when we went out to organizations and we did workshops, that was our biggest aha moment for us, that people who are currently centered need to also feel seen and heard and understood, and that mitigates a little bit of this kind of defensive reaction. When you are, well, my co-founder Donalyn and I, we are college professors, we are very comfortable in speaking to rooms of people that don't want to be there. But they, yeah, we get it, yeah. You have to take it for the major. But it's a question of making everyone in the workshop, everyone in the conversation feel comfortable with the level of the conversation. some of the initiatives that were slapped onto existing structures people felt confronted, like you're racist, you're living your life wrong, let me explain to you how to live your life right. That, as we learn, is something to be aware of in our own language when bringing this to people's attention and making everyone feel safe in the conversation.
One of the things we also talked about and you all have experienced is this notion of understanding what culture is versus what climate is. And so often they're used interchangeably, but they're quite different, because the culture is around what we do and the climate is how we feel about what we do, right? And so this notion of using data to tell the story. Can you tell us a little bit more, Mona, about how you have been able to use data to tell the story and how data has been essential in your role?
Absolutely. I never enter a meeting without data, because what you'll hear almost immediately, like for hiring talent, for example, oh, they're not out there. We diverse talent doesn't exist in this space. We've hired possibly every robotics engineer that fits this profile, for example. And so you want to be able to go in and say, hey, this is the market analysis, this is the availability, this is the talent that's graduating, this is the talent with experience, this is our gap, this is our opportunity internally from a talent perspective. From an inclusion perspective, it's really important. You mentioned the different surveys and focus groups. Have that data ready too. We look at our Credo survey at J&J. When you're looking at your survey data, it's not just overall, okay, we scored a 90% on our inclusion or engagement, whatever the number is, but you want to break down the data as well. You want to see how your employees are feeling by gender, by age, by race, by ethnicity, whatever the dimensions you can get your hands on. You want to look at every opportunity there is to make sure that every employee that is showing up to work feels included, feels safe, and feels engaged. And that's why the data is absolutely critical. And then you're capturing employee voices through focus groups. So if you're hearing that maybe there's a lot of turnover, for example, you want to look at that data and try to understand, is it turnover of a certain level? Is it turnover at a certain age? Is it turnover at a certain period of time spent at a company? Is it turnover by race or gender? And again, try to pinpoint where the issues are, and then dive in with your focus groups and your action plans. Don't ever try to go in to a meeting based on a feeling or saying, I feel like employees are leaving because of this. Business leaders won't buy into it. What they can't argue with, what they can buy into, is when you present the data fact by fact. And that's where I found the most success, is being able to go in with the feelings sometimes, but also, backing it up by strong facts and data.
Yeah, we talked about that feeling being accurate, but not being factual.
Yes, exactly.
So that feeling can be accurate, but not factual. We also talked about this notion of people not feeling they have resources. There is not enough money to do this work. And Michele, you brought up an interesting thing around how you need to invest and what that investment looks like in terms of measurements of success and business imperative. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. It boils down again to what their strategic objectives are, what the business objectives are of an organization. And I believe that, it's essential for leaders to recognize that their greatest assets are their people. And oftentimes, especially for for-profit organizations that are measuring, earnings and profits, oftentimes people sort of fall to the bottom. So when it comes to really wanting to make sure that an organization is positioning itself to be an employer of choice, and where their retention rates are maintained, if not increased, and their attrition rates in terms of turnover gets decreased, it's important that they recognize that not only monetary investment, but resources are applied to DEIB, and that there are sponsors and allies and advocates that are going to be part of the employee resource groups, or that there are mentorship programs or sponsorship programs. There has to be a financial investment. And even coaching is important as well. That may be more on a one-to-one basis or trainings, but being able to have allocations in one's budget that either is the discretion of the department head or an overall budget that comes as a line item out of HR, learning and development, talent management. But again, it's recognizing that those monies need to be allocated and part of the overall budget that's part of the strategic plan. That's the investment that shows that you have stake in it, and that, again, it's not just a good to have, but it's now a strategic imperative.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the mentorship action and the sponsorship action, and how that plays out within the organization?
Sure. So I believe on the last panel, they were talking about the value of having mentors and sponsors. So the distinction is, when we think about a mentor could be someone within one's organization. And again, we're also becoming accustomed to what they call reverse mentorship, right? Where the younger generation is acting as the mentor. But in a traditional sense, the mentor is more of a seasoned, senior level individual who has experience and is looking to sort of guide and support the direction of what the mentee's goals are. The distinction between a mentor and a sponsor is well, let me just go back. So a mentor doesn't necessarily have to be an individual within your organization. They could have a career trajectory that is somewhat similar to, one that the mentee is looking to, the journey that they're looking to travel. From a sponsorship perspective, that ideally should be, again, a seasoned senior level associate leader within an organization who's leveraging their credibility to really advocate and speak up for the protege when they're not in the room. And it's imperative for whether you're a protege or a mentee to have a personal board of directors. As a coach, I often coach my clients and recognize that you are the CEO of your life. And if you are too dependent on the organization to navigate your career, you're going to lose, right? So being able to establish a personal board of directors ensures that on your board is your mentor, your sponsor, your manager. It may be an external coach, but being able to have these parties who are investing in you, your future, and ensuring that, again, the goals that you have for yourself, perhaps within the organization. And it doesn't always mean advancement. It could just be that your voice is heard and that, what role you play, what contributions and values that you contribute to the organization is well known, because that can, really help to support your direction. So that's the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship.
And can you also tell us a little bit more about the risk factors? Because we talked a lot about the litigation liabilities when you don't do this work.
Yeah. So when we think about DEIB, and we think about, what needs to be measured, it's not just sort of the bottom line, it's what expenses can be cut. When organizations are having lawsuits brought about because of discrimination or unfair hiring practices, these things need to be measured by an organization, because that is an expense that can really cut into profits and revenue. So being able to keep their finger on the pulse of, what we need to do in order to ensure that those legal actions, those mitigations, those risks can be addressed is key.
So this is for everyone on the panel. You can volunteer to go first or not, whatever. Can you talk a little bit more about managing and dealing with resistance, and what resistance really looks like when you are trying to do this work?
Sure, I'll go first. Resistance looks like we had in our audit of that little town, we had one survey question that really helped the project administrators understand how to approach it best. The question was, do you think our national conversation on diversity is long overdue, not helpful, harmful? People who thought it was harmful, that's where you have to tread carefully. If you don't get the buy-in, you aren't going to get any change, and you will actually get people resigning or working to undermine those efforts. But you do need to identify where the resistance is to it. And the kind of programming, the kind of coaching that those people need will be much more intensive than the kind of coaching people who say, this is long overdue, inject it into my veins, I love it, let's talk about it. It's what makes it difficult, I feel, when encountering resistance is that the data aren't lying. The generation that's coming into the workforce have these attitudes, have these values, and they are coming into the workforce. There's no way to keep them out of it if we want to keep our economy moving. I was just reading a population survey that demographers think, because of the current low birth rate and the ways that we are forming families, they think by the year 2100 that world population will actually be flat for the first time in human history. It will not be growing. So these are the people who value the work, the people who are not resisting are coming and will eventually overwhelm, I feel, the people who are resisting. And we're not doing people resisting it any favors in helping them to deny this. I think as people devoted to inclusion and belonging, I think we do need to find a way to help those people also navigate this coming revolution.
Can I put a spin on that?
Sure.
So,
Spin away.
So what's interesting, there was a potential client, I won't name the name because if I did, you'd probably recognize the organization, but suffice
You're
to say...
You're protecting the guilty and the innocent, I got it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Confirm nor deny.
Right, exactly. What's interesting is this particular organization, what they're representing is not resistance, but apathy. So there were 2 or 3 line managers, sort of at a supervisory, managerial level, who spoke up to management and basically said, you know what, we are a global organization, and it's really important that we have DEIB initiatives. So they were given authority to create a DEIB advisory committee. And part of that committee not only is them, but also people in HR and even the chief HR officer. So what's interesting is, and we've been talking to them for about maybe 6 months to almost a year, because they are trying to get senior management to invest and put money where their mouth is, and it's not happening. So not outright resistance, because senior management has said, sure, get together, develop an advisory committee, meet with whatever frequency and cadence you choose to, and, bring to us ideas and thoughts and strategies, but it's not getting passed. There's apathy. So it's interesting because it's very confusing to the advisory committee, because it's like, well, wait a minute, we've been given somewhat of the runway, but yet there's no traction. We're not really able to get any funding in order to sort of make things, or get the buy-in from various department heads. So sometimes organizations may not necessarily feel the overt resistance, but apathy in and of itself looks like, you're getting a nod when at the end of the day, there's really no traction.
Thank you for that.
All right. So I have a couple of examples, but I remember when I was starting to lead courageous conversations with the organization, and we were talking about race for the first time, and we were talking about diversity and what equity means and what inclusion means, and people were silent. They didn't want to talk about it. They're like, this is uncomfortable. People didn't show up to the workshops, and I was like, okay. I started to get a little annoyed and angry, and I can't do my job, and I'm not successful. And so you take a few steps back, and you're like, okay, wait, I have to understand what the root cause of this is. And so I tried this exercise, and it was so enlightening for me. I put up an empty screen on the Teams call, and I asked the question. I said, why haven't you had the conversation with your teams? And I told them, it's confidential. I can't see who's writing on the screen. I can't see, I can't connect the dots to anyone. And so you started to see the words populate on the screen. And it was fear. It was, I don't know what to say. And I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. And I'm afraid I'll be penalized for that. And so as I saw these words come on the screen, I was like, whoa, this is actually incredible. And not only was it incredible for these words to populate on the screen for me to understand, it was incredible for those that were on the call, that were part of the conversation, to see that this wasn't coming from a negative space. It was coming from a space of not knowing what to say or do when finally faced with the ripping off the Band-Aid and saying, hey, we're going to talk about it all now in the workplace, you know? And so I think one of the things I'm appreciating that J&J has done is that they are enabling their leaders. It's not enough to just say, okay, we're going to be, we're going to be inclusive. We're going to focus on diversity and equity. You have to enable your leaders. And so what they've done is they've had required training. 90% of the entire organization has taken unconscious bias training. They've also built training for their people leaders. And about 87% of those people leaders who have taken this course said they felt enabled to go off and build their own DEI action plans, which is incredible as a result of just 30 minutes spent on educating themselves in this space. And so not only is it good to have a strategy, not only is it good for leaders to say this is important, but you have to enable your leaders and you have to understand where some of this, this hesitancy is coming from and then fix that.
One of the things I'm hearing from all three of you is this notion that at this intersection of commitment, retention, and success is this idea of not just being transactional, but being transformative. That it really takes you that kind of mindset. And I'll share a quick story because I think this is important. I was doing a presentation for a group of human resources professionals across the country, room a little bigger than this. And one of the things that came up was this idea of being a kind person and being charitable. That means I'm doing the right thing. This is how I make my contribution to dealing with my emotional guilt. And the individual shared a story around how he worked with at-risk youth. And at-risk youth were brought into his home and they were treated just as his kid. And these at-risk youth were exposed to, and by the fourth time he said at-risk. I paused. I said, can you just pause for a moment? I want you to imagine if you talked about these young men as young men at promise and not at risk. How then would their lives be because you're a part of it? So when we have people that feel like they're already doing good, and they may have good intentions that don't equal the impact, that's also a way of resistance because they're not opening up that lens to see things differently. So when we talk about our mindset, we have to remember that what we do and how we move forward or pay forward what we learn matters. It matters. And so I want to talk a little bit more about some of the success, the way that you best describe your greatest success. Because you have been in spaces where you've had to deal with a leadership commitment. You already talked to us a lot about retention and what doesn't retain folks. Tell us about success and what success can look like so folks will want to stay within the organizations.
I'll sort of speak to that, and I hope that I'll answer it somewhat directly. But what's coming to mind is when I think, especially as a coach, about success, it's coaching men and women at any level of an organization to be change agents and transformative leaders. However, the secret ingredient to becoming both or either of those is what they call managerial courage. That is a competency that research organizations have identified as the top 5 skill set or competency that any leader needs to possess. And managerial courage is to be able to have the confidence and conviction to express one's opinion when met with opposition. And oftentimes, what silences individuals and inhibits their ability to be transformative leaders and change agents is the fear of retaliation. I remember when I was in corporate, prior to becoming a coach, my evaluation about maybe my 3rd year is that I was highly opinionated. And I was dinged for that. But yet, I considered that a plus. I was like, thank you, yes. I want to be opinionated. I want to make sure that I'm not leaving my brain on the pillow when I come to work every day. And eventually, became rewarded because I really didn't know how to keep my mouth shut, but I did it in a tactful and diplomatic way. And simply because of my experience in doing that, being able to impart that level of wisdom to other people within organizations as their coach, to applaud and support and validate what managerial courage looks like, is to make sure that, again, you are a transformative leader and you're bringing your points of view and you're influencing, because that is what will hopefully bring about the change that's necessary. And again, the success that an organization is looking for.
Thank you.
I can go next. For me, it's about building a workplace where every single employee feels like they belong, that there is equitable access, there is equitable opportunity to grow, develop, and succeed. I think about one situation that really is going to stay with me forever. It was a gay sales leader in Turkey who really wanted to get married to his partner. And in Turkey, that wasn't legal yet. And he had a whole career ahead of him. He was highly successful. And when I brought this to leadership, there was no hesitancy in saying, let's get him out of there. Let's get him into Germany, and where he can still be highly successful and he can go on and live his life authentically, who he is, with his partner. That was one of the most beautiful things, is seeing an organization lean in without question to help people live their full identities. And that's why I'm in this space, and that's why I'm in this work, and I live to make an impact in people's lives in this way and help bring others along so that they can make that impact as well.
For us, it looks like getting everyone to understand that no one is outside of this. It can get very easy to talk about concepts and not have it be personal. And one of the exercises we like to do is the identity test, which we can do right here, everyone right here, if you just take a minute and clear and think and breathe, and you fill in a blank that I'm going to give you, which is, I am a blank. You don't have to tell anyone your answer, but if you think about the first thing that pops into your head, I am a blank. If your answer was your career, your job, your achievements, then you are in an identity that historically we have not encouraged you to think about. If your identity had to do with being a woman, a wife, a mother, anything of the social identities, then you know that you're in an identity that is brought to your attention all the time. Another thing we like to make it personal is if you are a right-handed person, or if you are a left-handed person. If you think about the way you move through the world, right-handed people never have to think about it. Left-handed people, it is brought to your attention at least once a day. I'm lefty. It's brought to your attention at least once a day that you're left-handed and something's not working, the desk, the car, something. And that is an example of just the ways we sort ourselves out, and a way to make it personal, and a way to get everyone to understand that it's something. Take the issue, it may not be handedness, but take that issue and translate it out, and it helps people to empathize with each other, and it helps righties to understand the lefties, it helps lefties to understand how righties are just like sailing through it, and it's something that can help connect everyone.
Thank you for sharing that, because one of the things you talked about with our group was this idea of having meaningful and thoughtful inclusivity. So this idea of how do we think about this in terms, in a meaningful way that allows us to talk about our head, our heart, and our hands. So it's that idea of what we do and what we think about. What we think about has to convince us that something needs to happen. What we feel in our hearts gives us a real desire and a passion to do what we think is best. And what we do with our hands says, I am capable. I am able to do these things. Now, however you enter that space or that mindset, whether you did something and you didn't think about it, or you felt a certain way and you did something and acted without thinking about it, however you enter into that space, we wanted to make sure that when we talk about these intersections of leadership commitment, employee retention, and success, that we're able to connect the head, the heart, and the hand. That was our ending of discussion here with us. So you want to share with the group a little bit about how you have been able to make that connection and do the work and practice.
Yeah, when we do these exercises and when people make that connection in their minds between that no one is being blamed and also no one is being tasked with taking the lead on it. So many times people who are in a position to know the most about this history are asked to teach everybody else this history. And what we try to do is empower everyone to come to the middle on it. Like, so if you've never given thought to diversity and inclusion and you're being asked to think about it for the first time, or you think that it's about time we had this conversation, it's very important that people come to the center on it and the same understanding and understand that there's no way out except forward. And we have to make this understanding together. And what I was struck by too, by what you were talking about with the coaching and the data, is that all of that feeds into a culture of psychological safety when people at the top, decision makers, and people who have the power to implement these programs do actually implement these programs because they themselves feel safe, they understand the issues, and they understand the impact that this will have on the organization, then they create a climate in which no one is afraid to speak up. No, being opinionated is not a minus on your evaluation. And you are really ensuring the success of your organization, because always in the back of my mind is that these 20-year-olds are coming out here expecting you to know how to do this. And they don't have patience when you don't know how to do it. They'll just decline the job offer and go somewhere else.
Yeah, I'll sort of also anchor that when you think about the hand, the heart, and the, what it was, hand, heart?
Head, heart, and hand.
Right, okay, so head, heart, hand. When we think about the heart, we think about an organization's mission statement, or even their credo, which oftentimes is somewhat infused with sort of emotion. You know, this is who we are, or the statement of what we want to become. And being able to ensure that in some way, shape, or form, a mission is being carried out by what employees do with their head and their hands. So yeah, it's being able to sort of connect it to the mission statement or the credo, and not just have it be something that's on their website or, you know, behind the receptionist's desk, but something that is a living, breathing organism.
So in the interest of time, I shared my refugee story, and so I'll use that as the example. And really finding someone that will say yes. Find your passion, find an idea for it that's going to impact the business or your team, and find the person that's going to say yes. In my case, the head of HR was an Afghan refugee when she was 5. I knew she was going to say yes. If you're looking for a sponsor of HBA or a sponsor of an LGBTQ ERG, go to Google, search your leaders up. They post everything on LinkedIn. Find people that are passionate about the causes that you care about, because those are the people that are going to say yes. Don't take a no for an answer. Find the person that's going to say yes.
Thank you all so much for this. Remember, you never know how much your past will affect your future until it shows up in your present. You are the tools for change. It's not going to be us telling you what to do. It's you actually figuring it out and making sure you do something differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you.